In April of 1841, Silas Rutledge shocked South Carolina. But in October of 1872, on the other side of a continent still stitching itself together with railroads and greed, another man made an announcement that froze the blood of the Pacific Northwest. Samuel Hargrave, the wealthiest lumber baron in the Washington Territory, placed his two children, 8-year-old Elliot and 6-year-old Clara, under the complete and total authority of a man known only as the Drifter. This was not an adoption, not an apprenticeship. It was a surrender. Hargrave claimed it was a desperate medical treatment for a strange ailment that had befallen them. The Society of Everett was scandalized, but they had no idea what Hargrave was truly bargaining for, or what the Drifter would awaken in those two children over the following months. By November, Elliot and Clara had changed in ways that defied explanation. Their eyes held for centuries. Their whispers could silence a room. By December, 9 people had vanished without a trace from the edge of the deep, dark woods. And on the night of January 20th, 1873, the entire company town of Willow Creek, Hargrave's private fiefdom, was erased from the map as if a giant hand had wiped it clean from the earth. What really transpired between that nameless wanderer and the lumber baron's heirs? What did he teach them, or what did he unlock within them, that terrified every soul who witnessed it? Before we unearth this buried piece of history, make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and comment below with the state you're watching from. Now, let me take you back to where the rain began. The autumn of 1872 in the Washington Territory wasn't a season. It was a prolonged drowning. The monsoon rains fell with a vengeance that year, as if the sky itself was trying to wash the stain of human ambition from the land. The forests around Everett were cathedrals of gloom, so dense that even at noon the light fractured into a perpetual, green-tinged twilight. The air was solid with moisture, thick with the smell of wet cedar, damp earth, and the sweet, unsettling rot of a million fallen leaves. The Skycomish River, usually a silver thread, had become a roaring, coffee-brown torrent, its banks gnawed away by the current. And through this saturated world echoed the sounds of industry, the shriek of saws biting into ancient timber, the groan of ox carts sinking into mud, the distant shouts of men who were paid in company scrip to conquer the unconquerable. This was wealth hewn from the heart of the wilderness, prosperity measured in board feet and extracted through backbreaking labor. All of it justified by men like Samuel Hargrave, who saw not a living ecosystem, but a ledger of profit waiting to be tallied. Willow Creek was the crown jewel of Hargrave's empire. A private company town nestled in a valley that his scouts had claimed. It housed 200 lumberjacks, their families, a company store, a chapel, and Hargrave's own imposing manor house that overlooked it all like a sentinel. He owned everything: the land, the houses, the store, the church pulpit. He owned the debts, and in a way that mattered more in that time and place, he owned the futures of every soul who lived there. Samuel was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains he stripped. In his 50s, with a beard like a thicket of iron filings and eyes the color of a winter sea, he was known as fair but ruthless, a man of contracts and consequences. His wife, Eleanor, a gentlewoman from Boston who had never acclimated to the raw edge of the frontier, had died of a fever 2 years prior, leaving him alone with Elliot and Clara. The children were quiet, observant, and deeply attached to each other. They were also, according to the few tutors who passed through, unusually perceptive. They would point to places in the forest and claim to see shimmering people. They held conversations with the empty air. At first, it was dismissed as the vivid imagination of lonely children. But after Eleanor's death, it intensified. Their sleep was plagued by terrible nightmares. They began sleepwalking, often found miles from the house, standing barefoot in the freezing creek, murmuring about the old ones and the debt. Hargrave, a man of steel and steam, had no patience for phantoms. He summoned doctors from Seattle and Portland. They diagnosed hysterical neurosis and frontier melancholia. They prescribed tinctures of laudanum to quiet their nerves, bleeding to balance their humors. The children only grew paler, quieter, more detached. The final straw came on the night of the autumn equinox. A massive storm lashed Willow Creek. During its peak, every single hound dog in the town, over 24 of them, began howling in unison, not at the storm, but at Hargrave's house. When a group of men braved the rain to check, they found Elliot and Clara standing on the porch, hand in hand, perfectly dry despite the horizontal rain, their eyes reflecting the lightning in a way that wasn't natural. They were speaking in a low, chanted unison, a string of sounds that resembled no language the lumberjacks, men from Sweden, Ireland, and Maine had ever heard. The dogs fell silent the moment the children stopped. The next morning, Samuel Hargrave, a man who feared nothing tangible, made a decision born of a terror he could not name or shoot. He sent for the drifter. The drifter arrived a week later, with the rain as his constant companion. He came on foot, emerging from the tree line like a shadow detaching itself from the gloom. No one knew where he came from. He carried no bag, wore clothes that seemed both worn and timeless. A heavy coat of undyed wool, trousers tucked into muddy boots. His face was difficult to remember the moment you looked away. Only his eyes left an impression, dark, depthless, and holding a kind of weary ancientness. He asked for no one, but walked directly to Hargrave's manor. The meeting between the lumber king and the wanderer lasted through the night. Witnesses reported no raised voices, only the low, relentless murmur of conversation that made the servants outside the study door feel cold. The terms were simple, brutal, and utterly inexplicable. Hargrave, in a town meeting called the next day, his face ashen, announced that the drifter possessed knowledge of old-world remedies and mental sciences that might cure his children. As part of this treatment, he was granting the drifter complete and uncontested authority over Elliot and Clara for a period of 1 year. They would live with him in a cabin deep in the woods, at the edge of the contested logging zone. Hargrave would not interfere, no matter what he heard. The town was aghast. To hand over 2 white children, the heirs to an empire, to a man who was essentially a vagrant, it was social suicide. It was madness. But Hargrave was resolute. The pressure from the unseen, from the whispers of his children and the silent judgment of the trees, had broken something in his pragmatic soul. He was no longer fighting for their sanity, but for a release from the eerie wrongness that had infested his home. The drifter took the children that very evening. Elliot and Clara went without protest, without even a backward glance at their father. They each took one of the drifter's hands, and the 3 of them walked into the forest and were swallowed by the mist. For the first month, nothing was heard. Then the sounds began, not from the cabin, which was too far to hear, but from the woods themselves. Lumberjacks working the western slope would hear children's laughter echoing from empty ravines. The sound of small feet running through underbrush would circle a work crew, though no one was ever seen. Tools began to go missing: axes, saws, peavies, only to be found days later, arranged in strange, circular patterns deep in the woods. The steel rusted as if aged for decades in a single night. The animals behaved strangely. Deer would stand and stare blankly at the men, unfazed by their presence. Birds would fall silent when certain paths were taken. Then, in late November, a logger named Bjorn went missing. A massive, fearless Swede, he had scoffed at the stories. He'd been hired to cut a stand of old-growth cedar near the drifter's cabin. He never returned for supper. A search party found his axe, embedded in the trunk of a cedar so large it would have taken 10 men to hug it. The blade was cold, colder than the freezing air, and covered in a slick, faintly glowing lichen that no one recognized. Of Bjorn, there was no sign, except for a single child-sized handprint pressed into the moss at the base of the tree, facing the trunk. The disappearances started in earnest after that. They were always people who had scoffed or who had trespassed too near the cabin, or who had been particularly cruel to the land. Men who wasted timber, or who polluted the creek with mill runoff. One by one, they vanished. A hat left behind. A boot print that ended abruptly in the middle of a clearing. A whisper on the wind that sounded like your name. The town of Willow Creek was now a prison of fear, surrounded by a forest that had become a living, watching entity. And Samuel Hargrave, locked in his manor, drank brandy and stared at the portrait of his wife, realizing too late that his bargain may not have been to cure his children, but to pay a debt he never knew he owed. By December, Elliot and Clara were seen again, but they were not the same. They would appear at the tree line at dusk, just watching. They never came closer. Their clothes were clean but simple, made of woven fibers that didn't look like wool or cotton. Their faces were serene, devoid of childhood's whimsy. Their eyes, when they caught the fading light, held a faint, silvery luminescence, like the sheen on a mushroom in a moonlit forest. They did not speak to anyone who approached, only watched with a detached, ancient curiosity. The drifter was always a shadow behind them, a silent guardian. It became clear that whatever was happening was not a treatment. It was a transformation. The children were becoming something else, wards of the forest, avatars of whatever ancient presence the drifter served or communed with. The disappearances, it was whispered, were not kidnappings. They were reclamations, payments taken for the theft of the trees, for the scar upon the land that was Willow Creek. Hargrave, driven by a mix of guilt, terror, and crumbling pride, finally acted. On January 19th, he gathered a posse of 20 men, the most desperate, the most greedy, those who would do anything for a bonus of gold coin. They were armed with rifles, axes, and torches. Their mission was simple: raid the cabin, take back the children by force, and drive the drifter out or kill him. They marched at first light, a line of grim-faced men moving against the heartbeat of the woods. They found the cabin nestled in a hollow, not built from cut lumber, but seemingly grown from the intertwined roots and trunks of several massive cedars. It was silent, no smoke from the chimney. The posse surrounded it, their bravado fading in the oppressive quiet. Hargrave kicked in the door. The interior was a single room, empty of furniture. The walls were covered in intricate, carved symbols that seemed to move in the dim light. In the center of the dirt floor was a large, complex design drawn in ash and crushed stone. A spiral within a spiral, intersecting with lines that looked like roots and rivers. The cabin was a focal point, a ritual space. It was empty. The drifter and the children were gone. As the men stood there, confused and terrified, the first sound began. It started as a low hum, vibrating up through the soles of their boots. Then it grew into a rumble, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. The trees surrounding the hollow began to sway, not from wind, but from a deep, rhythmic motion. The men broke and ran, crashing back through the forest toward Willow Creek in a blind panic. They arrived to find the town in an uproar. The Skycomish River, swollen from weeks of rain, was not just flooding. It was changing course. Before the eyes of the entire population, the mighty river was twisting, its brown water clawing at a new path, one that led directly toward the valley floor where Willow Creek sat. And leading the water, standing at the very crest of the oncoming wall of mud and debris, were three figures. The drifter stood in the center, his arms raised. On either side of him stood Elliot and Clara, their hands clasped with his. Their silvery eyes were blazing like captured stars. They were not fighting the current. They were guiding it. This was no natural disaster. This was an eviction. What happened next was a chaos of biblical proportions. The redirected river slammed into the lower town, swallowing houses, the mill, the company store in a churning, roaring deluge of mud, logs, and shattered dreams. People screamed, climbing to rooftops, scrambling for the higher ground of the manor. But the water and the earth itself seemed sentient. It sought out the foundations of Hargrave's world. Through the torrential rain and howling wind, one sound cut through clearly, the sound of two children, laughing. Not a malicious laugh, but the pure, joyful laugh of children at play, a horrifying contrast to the destruction below. Samuel Hargrave, from the balcony of his manor, watched as the water rose to his very porch steps. He saw his children, transformed and powerful, commanding the primal forces he had sought to tame. In that moment, he understood the debt of the land, the debt of the trees, the debt of his ambition. He had not paid it with money or scrip. He had paid it with his heirs. As a massive, uprooted cedar, a king of the forest he had felled so many of, spun in the current and smashed into the supports of his house. The last thing Samuel Hargrave saw was the serene, ancient face of the drifter, looking directly at him from the heart of the flood. Then darkness. When the sun rose on January 21st, Willow Creek was gone. Not damaged, not flooded, gone. The river had settled into a new channel, a wide, placid flow over what had once been streets and homes. A thick, impossible layer of silt and perfectly sorted gravel, smooth as a riverbed, covered everything. No bodies were recovered. No significant debris remained. It was as if the town had been carefully, thoroughly scrubbed from the earth. Of the 200 souls, only a handful who had fled early up the highest ridge survived to tell the tale. They spoke of the laughing children, the guiding drifter, the living river. Their accounts were dismissed as the hysterical ravings of traumatized survivors. The official record called it a catastrophic landslide and flash flood, a tragic act of God. The Hargrave fortune, with no heirs, was absorbed by creditors. The land was deemed cursed and left alone. Elliot, Clara, and the drifter were never seen again. But the story didn't die. It evolved into legend among the loggers and indigenous tribes of the region. They speak of the protectors, a man and 2 children with silver eyes who are seen in the deepest old-growth forests, always in the periphery of vision. They are said to guard the last wild places. When a logger takes a tree he shouldn't, or a company pollutes a stream, strange things happen. Tools fail, machinery breaks, and sometimes, men who are too greedy, too cruel to the land, simply vanish, leaving behind only a child's handprint in the moss, facing the oldest tree in the grove. Was the drifter a sorcerer? A ghost? A manifestation of the land's own anger? Were Elliot and Clara cured? Or were they sacrificed to something older than America itself? The truth is buried under tons of silent silt and the relentless growth of the Washington forest. But in the quiet moments, when the mist hangs low in the hollows, you can almost hear it. The echo of laughter and the relentless, patient sound of water, waiting for the next debt to come due. What do you think? Did Hargrave's children become monsters? Or did they become something else entirely? Do you believe the spirits of a place can demand such a terrible payment? Let me know in the comments below. If you want more tales of historical horrors and buried secrets, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that blurs the line between past and nightmare. Remember, some histories aren't found in books. They're whispered by the trees. See you in the next video.